Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. In John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, after the fall, the angel takes Adam to a hill of paradise the highest to show him all earth's kingdoms and their glory. His eye might there command wherever stood, city of old or modern fame, the seat of mightiest empire. From the destined walls of Cambalu, seat of Cathian Can and Samarkand by Oxus, Timur's throne to Paquin of Sinian kings, and thence to Agra and Lahore of great Mughal. As William Dalrymple says, this was hardly an understatement. By the age of Milton, Lahore had grown larger than Constantinople, and with its 2 million inhabitants, dwarfed both London and Paris. Historically, cities have been engines of growth and centers of socioeconomic and political activity. From scientific and technological inventions and discoveries to the flourishing of arts and culture, cities have been what some call man's greatest invention. Yet, just 2 centuries ago, only 3% of the world's population lived in cities. At the dawn of the 20th century, it was just 14%. Today, it's exploded to more than half the world's population. And by the year 2030, more than 5 billion people, that's 6 out of every 10 human beings, will live in cities and urban centers. We are on our way to becoming what Richard Florida calls Homo urbanus. Digital technology is resulting in creating smart cities. But what makes the cities prosperous? Not all cities are smart or create prosperity for their inhabitants. How must they be governed? What kind of governance architecture helps cities and their dwellers grow? Evidence from around the world suggests that effective urban governments are at the heart of city development and prosperity. Pakistan has done several experiments with city and local government mechanisms to little avail. Recently, the Punjab Assembly has passed the Punjab Local Government Act 2019, establishing 9 metropolitan corporations for its major urban centers. To discuss what the act entails and what needs to be done to ensure that the metropolitan governments created under the legislation will be effective and independent, we have with us Dr. Nadeem Ul Haque, who's the Deputy Chairman Planning Commission, Dr. Ali Cheema, who teaches economics at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, Shahrukh Wani, who teaches at the University of Oxford. Welcome to all 3 of you. Dr. Haque, if I start with you, you were also heading the Planning Commission. Why are cities important, and why are city governments important?
I think, Ejaz, you summarized it very well at the top of the program, that cities are the engines of growth, from inventing food, to inventing steam, to inventing everything under the sun. Cities is where everything happens. And of course, trade was invented in cities. As you remember, the discovery of the world was started in cities. So everything happened in cities. Man is basically a herd animal. He lives together. He works best together. Individually, we are all totally useless. When we live together, we work together, we produce the best. So there's every reason for cities to be independent and for cities to be, organized in such a fashion that they work very well. Now, having said this, it is also very important that cities are governed in a fashion where they bring out the best in people, so that they lever the enterprise of man, which is best seen when they live in dense hives. And unfortunately, most of the world now is heading towards nationalism, where we think that cities are just one little spot in a sea of nationalism. And we also, in Pakistan, worship rural areas, where we think rural areas are very important. So we, in Pakistan, are very confused about cities, whereas the rest of the world is getting clearer that cities have to be administered, in a sense, independently by local government and have to be the engine of growth.
Okay. Cheema, I'm going to come to the bill and the act, and I know that you worked on parts of it, but I'm just trying to first establish the significance of cities as they are. And Shahrukh Wani, you wrote a piece in Dawn which was titled, "Has Punjab Just Taken a Step Towards Unlocking the Potential of Its Cities?" And you mentioned the bill, and you also lay down 3 conditions. First, you talk about an institutional architecture that allows for independence of urban governments. Second, you are looking at an institutional architecture which empowers urban governments by providing sufficient control over key local policies and the ability to raise sufficient local revenue. And third, you say that we need an institutional architecture that makes cooperation between various urban governments conducive. Now, this bill and, of course, now the act, do you think that it allows space on these three conditions that you're talking about in terms of, the basics of making the metropolitan governments effective?
Yeah, those cities are, Dr. Nadeem highlighted, it's what you make of them. They have enormous potential when people come together in high-dense environments. It unlocks knowledge spillovers and all of these economic effects, which are very good for productivity. The bill, at least in my view, compared to the bills we've had before, it does more of a job in achieving these three parameters, which I was thinking about, than any other time in our history we have done so. It does give, on paper at the very least, sufficient, gives them some degree of independence by moving accountability downwards to the jurisdiction they will govern. They do empower them on certain key issues. They do allow them, there is sufficient legal provision for them to raise taxes, particularly over property and land value, which is incredibly important. And third, it does allow, there's in fact an almost entire chapter on cooperation, vertical cooperation between other local subnational governments. And of course, there has to be then, we will see how good vertical cooperation is also with provincial and federal governments, which is also very important for cities to function well. But there are, of course, question marks around whether the intent will be fulfilled or not, because there's enough room for the provincial government to intervene and set that sort of precedent in which these cities are not, these metropolitan corporations are not given enough empowerment and enough independence to do what they want to do. So it really depends on how does the spirit of the law is intact by the provincial government or not, because there's enough room legally for the government, provincial government, at least in my view, that they can interfere and sort of damage the sort of the architecture conducive, which is generally conducive to good, effectively run cities.
Okay, Ali Cheema, explain to us what this law is. How is it different from Musharraf's devolution and what Shahrukh is talking about? Because there is also the placement of a bureaucrat somewhere in that architecture, which could possibly be provide space to the provincial government to intervene into local matters. So explain to us the pluses and the apprehensions.
So actually, can I take a step back?
Sure. You can take 2 steps back.
I mean, you started with Milton.
Yes.
I think I'd like to start with Tocqueville.
Okay.
So Tocqueville wrote a book, which is a very important book, which is called Democracies in the Americas.
Yeah.
And in that book, basically, Tocqueville compared the democratic evolutionary experiment in America to what he called the ancient regime, which
Correct.
is largely France. And at the heart of what he saw as something that was transformative and that he thought would catapult the Americas, and he was referring to the United States, into a strong democratic state is the idea of town hall democracy. Our democratic experiment...
Town hall democracy.
Yeah. Our sort of democratic or state-building interventions, and I'm not just talking about Pakistan, I'm talking about South Asia in general, there has been no town hall democracy. So we are the product of an administrative bureaucratic state. And the best description of the constitutional architecture of South Asia, which goes back to the India Act of 1935, can be summarized by a beautiful quote by the ex-Chief Minister of Kerala, who said that when it comes to federal-provincial relations, we get democracy, but when it comes to provincial-local government relations, we get bureaucracy. Yeah. So at the heart of the matter is that, when it comes to local municipal functions, we've had very weak experiments of municipal democracy. And the entire edifice that has been built up is basically built around administrative structure, which is led by the bureaucracy, and that is controlled by provincial politicians. So the nexus between the local citizenry, their municipal functions, some democratic edifice, and a bureaucratic structure has been missing. not just here, but in India. India, of course, has much richer experimentation and much richer variation. Now, when it comes to cities, what does that bureaucratic architecture look like? It's not even a bureaucratic architecture that is integrated. It's not, so it's fragmented. There are different agencies that divvy up basically the city function. So LDA, and it has huge conflicts of interest built into it. LDA is a developer of land and a regulator of land use. That's a conflictual relationship.
Correct.
That is different from water and sanitation. That is different from housing. Now, of course, they bundle it all up under the same minister, but these are fragmented bureaucracies. And when you think about cities, just even in terms of a narrow function such as settlement, so land use, basically you really can't have fragmented infrastructures because you can't think about water and sanitation provision in the absence of housing. You can't think about both these provisions, as Nadeem has been writing about for a very long time in a very rich way, without thinking about what is the right to movement in the city or parking in the city. So what you have is a very fragmented administrative structure.
So fragmented administrative structure.
Yeah.
And Shahrukh's third condition that I talked about earlier, in which he's talking about cooperation between various urban governments. So this is more like aggregation and cooperation, which we do not get when we have bureaucrats administering a city.
I mean, it's very loose, and each has their own agency to think about. So they're not, the integrated mechanism is neither integrated nor accountable through a very clearly defined accountability mechanism. And that has been the case in virtually every law that we've had in the past.
Okay. So how is this law different?
So I think what this law does, and its kind of newer features, is I don't think, so the law starts by creating a rural-urban divide, but that is actually not a new feature of the law. That was there in the 79 local government ordinance that was brought in under General Ejaz Ul Haque. The Musharraf experimentation actually finished the rural-urban divide. And then the 2013 Act, which was passed by the last PMLN government, resurrected the rural-urban divide. So this act maintains that division between rural and urban local governments. But what it does is that it sort of, when it comes to urban governance, it claims, and this is kind of indicated in the law, but this is a kind of policy claim of government, it commits to integrating the urban function. So it says that LDA, WASAs, they will all be devolved to local governments. Now, in principle, that could have been done under the 2013 Act as well, but it was never done. So in that, I think, is what Shahrukh was alluding to, whether that intent will actually ever be realized. Musharraf did not have a urban-rural separation, but they did recognize city-district governments, and there were very few. They had committed to doing the same thing, but they never actually did it. So I think the real test of this law, the first test, is whether they are able to devolve and integrate those functions. But where this law goes further than previous laws, it brings in another innovation, which is the major innovation that's happening around democratic accountability across the world, which is the experiment with directly elected mayors. This act adopts that innovation. So, we've never in our history had directly elected mayors. Mayors have always been indirectly elected. And these mayors will be backed by parties. So it is a partisan system. So that's a deviation from the Ayub regime and the Musharraf regime, which were non-party acts. The second thing that it does is it actually commits to ensuring proportionality in terms of representation in the assembly, which is now obviously going to be separate because you have a directly elected mayor and you have an assembly, which is going to be a check. So it adopts, and this is the first time this is happening in South Asia, a party-based proportional representation system. So that is, I think, the second innovation. The third thing that it actually puts a floor, so it takes a certain element of a cost, which is much bigger than has been done under any other previous law, and it commits to devolving a certain proportion of the provincial revenue receipt down to local governments. And the fourth thing, which I've already talked about, is the integration, particularly of the urban functions, which are largely municipal functions, and evolving them.
Okay. So, Dr. Nadeem Ul Haque, given how Ali Cheema has explained this new law, do you think that it will actually help transform the city, or, as Shahrukh said, to unlock the potential of the cities? And I ask you because, as Ali Cheema mentioned also, you've been writing about cities for a very long time.
Yes, I'm afraid we've, like in every other thing, I would say it's only about here, like in every other thing, we continue to remain confused. The exchange rate, the fund program, we continue to remain confused. On cities, we have been confused throughout. We, the Punjabis, especially the Punjabis, but maybe the Pakistanis too, we have a very strange romance with rural development, rural areas. We tend to think ourselves as rural people. We want to remain in a rural setting. We are sort of reluctantly urban, I should put it that way. We don't even want to make urban areas. For the last 70 years, we have wanted to come to Lahore, but wanted to live in a rural setting. So we forced Lahore to retain a rural setting. We made Lahore into what I call an urban village. Lahore is the biggest urban village in the world because it has no urban amenities. Having said that, I'll say once again, on the local government, we have been experimenting with local government since Ayub's time, but always resisted accepting cities for a start. Our civil service, which is a rural setting civil service, which was made by the British colonialism, that civil service does not want to accept urban areas because its origin lies in rural setting. It has always resisted any form of local government. And when we talk of local government, we want to give it a rural government. So Ali is right that this is the first local government law that actually has recognized city as an entity. Musharraf's local government law did not recognize city as an entity. It accepted city district, which is a very strange concept. A city metropolitan area, which Lahore and so many others are. We've got about 18 cities above 1 million. We've got about 70 cities above 100,000. 100,000 city in Europe or America is a very big city. So we've got very large cities. 70% of our population is urban. We are still confused about urbanity. In this law, Ali is right that yes, we've got cities recognized, but at the same time, there's a reluctant decentralization. The civil service still remains above the mayor, A. B, yes, there are directly elected mayors, but we have kind of now, we are trying to make the mayors into chief ministers. They're becoming very powerful. I would like to see a much more distributed local government, where the mayor is not the king of the city, where you have education sort of superintendents, where you have health, sanitary superintendents, whatever, you have a more distributed structure. I would see a much larger local council that operates like a parliament to check the mayor. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I would also like to see less sort of direct election. Because
I think there is a council which is going to, Ali Cheema, correct me if I'm wrong, there is a council. But go on.
Council,
I think
council is drawn off the vote of the mayor. Instead of being directly elected, now the council is drawn off the vote of mayor. Yes, it is a proportional representation from the mayor's vote, a party list vote. But as Ali Cheema's work is very important because it shows that the local dynasties are very much alive. The local dhada politics is very much alive. The local biradari politics is very much alive. And Ejaz, I would like to remind you of Fukuyama's famous book where he says the reason for the strong state or a modern state is to get over biradari politics. We have to figure out an electoral system how to get rid of biradari politics.
Wani, since you work generally on the cities, give us a sense of how some of the other cities in the world are governed. Because, you start, the starting sentence of your article is something that establishes very strongly what you think about the cities, and you say there is no path to prosperity which does not pass through cities. Absolutely none. So you obviously looking at cities as independent entities. as, in a way, a sort of living organism that grows and evolves and must be allowed to do so. So give us a comparison of how bigger cities are governed in rest of the world.
Yeah, so there's not going to be a single template which works for every city. Every city is different, and two cities in Pakistan would be different too, in fundamental ways. So it's very important to test and try policy decisions in which works best for the city. The thing was, a framework, if that exists, and that was my opinion, that the three things, if that exists generally, it tends to be leads to conducive local city level institutions which can effectively work. But that takes time, and that takes a lot of experimentation. Generally, for instance, Dr. Nadeem talked about the role of the sort of the checks and balances over the mayor. London, for instance, has a strong mayor v council system. Other cities have strong council and sort of a manager kind of a system, which they bring out a technocrat kind of a person. It really depends on the local context. It depends on the politics. It depends on how big the city is, what role provincial and federal governments have to play in it. Generally, because Dr. Cheema also alluded towards sort of the city level institutions and fragmentation, and I've done some work with a colleague of mine, Astrid, on this. Generally, the tenets we think would be good are generally leads to effective governance are clear allocation at city level. So within a city government, there's clear allocation of responsibility of who is responsible for what. We call it the authorizing environment. There's good degree of legitimacy. That's incredibly important, and often we forget. These city governments need to be considered legitimate by the people they govern, and that's often the problem we've had over history of our experimentations with decentralization at this level. And capacity to coordinate, which I also allude towards in the article, is that's incredibly important because the complexity is quite interesting, because higher the complexity, which is in cities, you need to govern them in the context they are. So that's why you devolve power. But at the same time, human settlements are growing, and they often go beyond the jurisdictions of a single city. And we need collective action to provide goods and services, especially if we want to do it fairly throughout the population. So that requires coordination. There's a very interesting tension there, which cities need to be able to sort of work through. So generally, I think the law does a good enough job to set up that framework, but there will be a lot of experimentation, and there needs to be experimentation and learning whether having non-partisan neighborhood council is the right decision or not. Should we strengthen the role of the council to overcheck the mayor's role? What is the role of the chief officer? In my opinion, the role of the chief officer seems to be slightly more bloated than it should be. That might be a way for the provincial government to intervene to the cities. So all of this needs to be debated and talked about, but we need to sustain the intent to devolve power, and I think that becomes a very big problem. We can't keep on changing the entire framework every few years, because there's a lot of cost involved in that. So we just did that, and there's already, I think, a challenge at the Punjab High Court by the outgoing some of the the local government officials. So we need to make sure that doesn't keep on happening again and again. So you keep the framework, but you tweak stuff depending on what is working and not, and what kind of incentives it's creating for the people who are elected and the people who it's governing. So it's a lot of, it's going to be a long process, but it's going to be a process that will be certainly worth it if you can unlock even a bit of potential you get from people being close to each other, which is enormous.
Absolutely. I'm going to take a short break, but at the other end of the break, we'll continue with this discussion of cities and this new Local Government Act. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing why cities are important, why they've been the engines of growth throughout human history. Why is it that we have been experimenting with city governments, haven't really come up with something to show for? And as Shahrukh was saying before we went to the break, that we have been trying to reinvent the wheel constantly. So something is not allowed to run. And that is one of the issues, Ali Cheema.
Actually, I don't entirely agree with that.
Okay.
Because the experiments that you're talking about, I mean, even if you take the most radical experiment that was done, which was under Musharraf.
Correct.
In a history of 70 years, that was alive for 5 years.
Correct.
right? I mean, if you look at the consistent power, it's just basically that cities have been administered under the provincial edifice that was set up during the colonial era.
Correct.
So these are really small deviations. The question is that the deviations have never been allowed to take root. Within a period of 3 to 4 years, they revert.
So which is where I was going with this, that Musharraf's devolution, it operated for roughly about, I think, 10 years?
6 years.
6 years. And even during his tenure, the provincial government had started eating into the entire thing. And there were people like Danial, who was then chairman of the Reconstruction Bureau, or whatever it was called then, who was agitating this point. So, and then when there was a transition to a full democracy, all the political parties agreed that this needs to be put to rest. And that's exactly what they did. Instead of tweaking it or allowing it to run and making it effective. So Shahrukh's concern about intent is very important, because even now with this, are the provincial governments actually, or in this case the Punjab government, actually going to allow the city government to be effective?
Well, my point is that it's almost like we're subjects waiting for the crown to take action.
Okay.
The question is, what is the action that the citizens want? And
Right.
that is really the journey from being subjects to citizens. We really don't care what power brokers want. They want their own interests to be sustained. But what is it that citizens would like in terms of town hall democracy? And the first question over there is, do citizens want town hall democracy? Are they willing to make this a political demand? Or are they not willing to make this a political demand? And if they are willing to make this a political demand, then whether you agree with this act or you want some modifications in this act, what is extremely important to articulate is, what is it that you want in terms of city or rural local governments, and what empowerment that you want. My contention is one of the empowerments that you want is that they should have independent sources of finance which are protected by law. That is something that you get in this act. Now, yes, a government can violate it, but it is violating a basic sort of feature of the law that it's enacted itself. So let us hold the government to account in terms of the feature that they've defined and enact themselves. Nadeem raised a very important point, and I think that is extremely worthy of debate. What is the electoral system that we want? Now, there's massive disproportionality. Let me give you some figures about the 2015 local government election. 2015 local government elections, there were two groups that swept that election. There was the PMLN group and the independent group. No other party got a whiff either way. PMLN chairpersons of union councils roughly bagged 30% of the vote, got about 43% of the seats. The top running independents bagged about 16% of the vote and got 37% of the seats. That effectively meant that 80% of the seats of the upper tier councils went to people who had roughly less than half the vote. That's massive disproportionality. Now, what this act is doing is it's saying we are going to build in proportionality. So if you want to vote for the People's Party, or you want to vote for the PMLN, or you want to vote for the PTI, your vote would count in terms of representation in Parliament, and it's not going to be wasted in the same way. Nadeem raised another point, which I think is important, which is the point about small constituencies and first past the post and fragmented capture of the political space. And that doing away with constituency politics effectively means that you have at-large constituencies, and that's going to shock the current political system. So I think that there are enough features that we want to push on, but I really welcome what Nadeem is saying about a debate on checks and balances, even on the debate on direct electoral accountability.
But Dr. Nadeem Ul Haque, do we want the debate to precede the implementation of this act, or do we implement it and then begin to debate and see for ourselves where it is going, where we need to tweak it, where we need to, because there's no policy, there's no legislation that does not have its minuses and pluses, and the only way that one can actually begin to figure out what needs to be corrected and what needs to be, added or subtracted from it after you've implemented it.
In the American Constitution, the Federalist Papers, they had a 2-3 year long debate, even though before as well as after the Constitution. They thoroughly debated and understood the Constitution at almost the town hall level as well, he's saying, absolutely right. And they spent a lot of time and effort thinking through it. We have not thought through anything.
In our case, there was, I think, a certain degree of consensus on what the Constitution should be or how it should be, and over the years it has evolved. It has gathered a lot of silt also, I agree. But I think the only way to go about it is through the parliament, and yes, I completely agree with you, by debating. Now, as far as debate is concerned, we obviously, don't debate anything, including the budget, which is the appropriations bill, which is obviously debated a lot before it is approved in many other countries in the world. So, yes, debate is important, but I think the thought that somehow we need to uproot this constitution is going to open up Pandora's box, because this is something that we have to work in and through, and not just discard it and try and get something new.
When I say that we have not thought about it, debated it, does not mean that we should uproot anything. I'm not for uprooting anything. I'm only for debating and understanding for a start. I was very amused, Ejaz. I was recently in Kabul, as you know, and I was very amused that Kabul has a think tank called the Afghan Research Unit. And when I asked them at a meeting with them, and I asked them, what are you researching? One of the subjects they said was researching the Constitution. They're actually researching their own Constitution, how it works, and talking about it. So it's not about uprooting anything. Nobody's saying uproot anything, but you must debate and think. But let's return to local government for a minute. Just, I would also argue with you, if you look at, I know you know far more history than I do, but whatever I've seen, the colonialists were not, as Shashi Tharoor says, were not interested in creating either a middle class or a manufacturing class or a city architecture. They wanted to maintain a rural government here that could give them primary products. They did not want to see us go in the direction of urbanization or developing a bourgeoisie or developing a manufacturing class. So we had a rural culture. We had a bureaucracy that fostered a rural culture. We wanted to maintain a rural society. That came into being in 1947, along with the Vaderas, as you know. So we have a worship rural culture. When I used to sit in cabinet and parliament, I saw they were always worshipping rural areas, and there were a large number of landlords, disproportionately large number of landlords in cabinet. So I think we have to take that into account. Our civil service, our landlord, our constitution, our parliaments are all based on rural areas. They don't want to give cities independence.
We have a Wordsworthian romance with rural areas and beautiful sort of waterfalls and the rest of it. But Shahrukh Wani, there's another issue that I want to highlight here, and I will bring this back to you also because you've done a lot of work on police. When you have metropolitan governments, you also need to have a police force that is a metropolitan police force. Now, currently, we have two tiers. There's a federal tier, which is the Police Service of Pakistan, and then we have the provincial tier. And we don't have the Met policing system. How important do you think that is to governance in a city, in a metropolis?
So I haven't really worked on law enforcement that much, or have done anything of significant, but it does go deeper into the issue of how much power are the provincial governments willing to decentralize to the district level, to the city level, and that is going to be a deeply political question in many ways. And Dr. Nadeem is right about that. Even if it's controlled, if the provincial assemblies have disproportionately larger control by people who have vested interest in rural areas, they might not care that much about urban areas, or they might not want to devolve something of that so much significance, which is policing, which has a lot of significance, which is political significance for governance. So I don't really know much about it, but cities do, in generally, it would make sense for them to have control over metropolitan, have local policing, as long as we have that checks and balances. We don't want the mayor to be able to control the police without any sort of checks and balance and be able to do whatever they want. So if those systems are in place at the city level, I think that would be a really good idea. But Dr. Cheema would know more about the law enforcement.
Ali Cheema.
So I think conditions matter. I think we're all agreed on one thing, that we're going towards if this gets implemented, which is the implementation of a more enhanced local government act, then you're trying to re-engineer the provincial state. And I think that the biggest pushback, even more than the urban pushback under the Musharraf law, was on the devolution of the revenue function, which was devolved to the district governments at that point. And the policing thing never even took root. So I think that, basically, even if we can get effective municipal functions, economic development functions, land use functions devolved in a meaningful way that creates an integrated bureaucracy and autonomy of a flow of funding, that would be a big step forward. There's no revolution. This is an evolutionary step. But we're stuck basically in the early 19th century. Let's at least take one step forward. But I think if you ask me about how would I think about the problem of devolving policing, I don't think it's an either or, that you would devolve the whole city police to the mayor or keep it with the chief minister. I think there are functions of policing that need to be devolved at the local level. And then there are other functions of policing that don't only need to be centralized at the provincial level, but also have to be coordinated with the federal level.
With the federal
You deal with terrorism. Terrorism is integrally related to conflict in cities. Yeah. Now that terrorist is going to move around between cities, between places. So a mayor's visibility on that problem is going to be very limited. So we have to think about federal architecture. We are not just talking about picking a whole thing whole hog and just giving it in some other way. And that's kind of the point that Shahrukh started with, that one of the things that this act has tried to do is it's tried to articulate much better. I think there's still room for improvement, but it's tried to articulate it about interagency coordination and interlocal government coordination. And I think those are kind of coordination and cooperative mechanisms that are extremely important.
So we are agreed that in order for the city's potential to be unlocked, as Shahrukh says, it needs to have its own governance architecture. There are no two ways about that.
And not in my view.
Yeah, so it seems I was in Seoul, and I was looking at their local government governance. The city, its administrative functions, its security, its everything is essentially a function of the metropolitan government there. I think it's the same with London and New York and Chicago. I mean, Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff of Obama's, the second most powerful position in the US, resigned because he wanted to contest the mayoral elections in Chicago, and which he won. So I think it's important, and hopefully, given some of the innovations in the act, there's greater chance of the government being more independent and effective. But I guess you're right in saying that at the end of the day, it's about us, the citizens of the city, in this case Lahore, to essentially put our weight behind the town hall democracy, as you called it. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali Cheema, Dr. Nadeem Ul Haque, Shahrukh Wani. We were discussing the new Punjab Local Government Act 2019. This is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.